While patrolling as 482R at approximately 1:59 a.m. on the above date, I was dispatched to Fat Daddy's bar in the 1600 block of Main Street reference a disturbance involving a baseball bat, while an auntie dispatch notified responding officers that the suspect had now left in a red car onto Main Street. As I continued in the direction of the bar, I heard Officer Eric Allen, 371T, call out that he possibly had the vehicle involved traveling westbound on Main Street at approximately 70 miles per hour. I then heard Officer Allen state that the vehicle was pulling over at Main Street and Cedar Street. I turned around as I was now in the 1400 block of Main Street traveling east. As I was responding to the area of the traffic stop, I heard that the vehicle was now pulling onto Bodart Street and had stopped in the alley. I assumed this was the alley that ran along the west side of the 720 Club. At this time, R was approaching Webster Avenue, still westbound on Main Street. I was no longer traveling with my emergency lights and siren as Officer Allen had 2 backup units with him. As I approached the intersection, I could see the squads directly ahead on Bodart Street with their emergency lights on. I could also see the suspect vehicle parked across the sidewalk, facing into the alley. I then saw what appeared to be numerous flashes coming from the street. I then heard what I believe was Officer Allen's voice on the radio telling dispatch that shots had been fired and that a rescue squad was needed. At this time, R activated my emergency lights and siren. When I pulled onto Bodart Street, I parked my squad behind Officer Richgall's and Kane's squad. Lieutenant Ackerman was already on scene asking for additional units to block off the street. I went directly to Officer Allen to see if he was okay, and then asked him who was involved. Officer Allen told me that Officer Salzman, Officer Richgall's, and Officer Kane. I immediately checked on those officers. All officers still had their guns drawn. I was then able to see onto the sidewalk to the east of the 720 Club. There, I observed a male lying face down. I could see a red substance was pooling out from where he was lying. I asked if there were any other suspects, and Officer Arlen stated there were 2 more in the vehicle. As officers approached the remaining 2 suspects in the vehicle, I observed a female R knew from numerous prior contacts as Rebecca L. Sonnenberg. When Rebecca saw me, she started yelling for me to come talk to her. I told Rebecca to just listen to the officers and cooperate, and I would talk to her later. At this time, R was notified that we possibly had an injured subject in the bar. When I entered into the bar, all the patrons in the front section of the bar were still lying on the floor. I observed a male lying on his back, approximately 10 to 15 feet from the entrance. The mare appeared to be bleeding from his right arm. I then looked around and asked if anyone else was injured. It did not appear that anyone else in the front area of the bar was injured. A male Hispanic who I assumed worked at the bar came over to me and asked if it was okay for people to get off the war. I told him yes, but nobody was to leave the bar. He said he would let the bouncer know not to let anyone leave. At this time, R went back outside. By this time, the officers had holstered their weapons and noticed the male lying on the sidewalk was now in cuffs. I could see the male was breathing at this time, and rescue was just pulling up. I returned to Officer Allen and asked him to give me a quick rundown as to what had occurred. Officer Allen stated to me, "You heard the disturbance at Fat Daddy's. I said yes. He then stated the male wouldn't get out of the vehicle and looked like he was digging around for something. He stated that the male then got out and pointed a gun directly at me and popped off a round. Eric stated that he then returned fire along with the other officers. I then told Officer Allen that I would eventually need his service weapon as well as the other officers. Officer Allen stated he knew. I informed him that I would wait until I got a replacement weapon for him. At this time, I heard Officer call for assistance inside of the bar. Numerous fights were breaking out. I ran inside the bar where rescue personnel were assisting the male who was injured and observed numerous people pushing and throwing punches. I then observed Officer Drobnik tackle a male to the ground who appeared to be fighting. I ran over to assist him with getting the male into cuffs. At this time, I was able to see that Officer Warich, Schmeichel, Bordelais, and Lieutenant Ackerman were also in the bar. I directed Officers Warich and Schmeichel to stand watch at the back door and not to let anyone leave until my authorization. At this time, I returned to out front of the bar. Rescue personnel were working on the suspect who was lying on the sidewalk. I retrieved a can of bright orange spray paint and marked where the head and feet of the suspect was. As the male was still breathing, rescue was getting ready to transport him to the hospital. I noticed a large pool of what I assumed was blood, a red and white baseball cap, and a pair of white tennis shoes with red laces several feet from where the male was laying. I also noticed a silver cell phone, which was open and lying against the wall of the building, several feet from where the male laid. I then exchanged my weapon with Officer Kane's. Since Officer Kane's weapon had been fired in the incident, I wanted to secure it. I later turned it over to Officer Merrill, where it was placed in a paper bag and brought into HQ. At this time, I called Lieutenant Johnson, who was the acting shift commander. I notified Lieutenant Johnson that we needed to notify the on-duty detective supervisor, the chief of police, and the commander. I also asked him to notify DPW as we would require barricades to protect the scene. Officer Allen was assisting directing officers to secure the scene. Cones were initially set up over the shell casings as we had numerous officers and rescue personnel passing in and out of the scene to assist with the injured as well as the witnesses. At this time, I asked Officer Warich to start clearing the scene. Everyone who witnessed what had occurred would remain on scene until transportation could be arranged to the station. I asked Lieutenant Johnson if he could facilitate and officer to bring the paddy wagon out. Lieutenant Johnson notified me that Officer Beyer would be A&RT shortly. All other patrons who did not observe anything or claim they did not see anything would not be released until they were ID and an address and phone number was obtained. Officers Warich and Schmeichel handled this task. At this time, an outer perimeter was taped off. This perimeter stretched the entire 700 block of Bodart. An inner perimeter was also established, which contained directly in front of the bar, the interior of the bar, and approximately 30 to 40 feet east and west of the entrance. Officer Strauff and myself then began to check the area along the street outside the bar and along the vehicles for the suspect weapon. We checked under every car along the front of the buildings all the way to Jackson Street, and along the curbing. At this time, we were unable to locate the suspect weapon. We did find some additional bullet fragments, which were covered and marked. At this time, I was able to get a hold of Chief Arts and notify him of the situation. Lieutenant Johnson informed me that Commander Molitor was contacted and detectives were being sent out to the scene. Once the bar was cleared, witnesses were transported to the station and held in the garage. At this time, I was able to send Officers Salzman, Richgels, and Kane back to the station. As Officer Allen was keeping a crime scene log and was very instrumental in the organization of the scene, he was the last to be released. I notified each officer that they were not to talk about the incident amongst themselves, and they were to report directly to Lieutenant Johnson once at the station. A short time later, the crime scene log was turned over to Officer Schmeichel, and Officer Allen was released from the scene. At this time, Lieutenant Nick and Detective Argel arrived on scene. Officers had originally covered the shell casings with traffic cones until rescue personnel had left the area. Since then, the cones were picked up as they were very bulky and distracting. Somebody had obtained a sleeve of plastic drinking cups from the interior of the bar. Officer Bordelais and myself placed yellow evidence tape on each cup and began to cover the shell casings and bullet fragments found along the sidewalk and interior of the bar. Areas where it appeared bullets had penetrated the walls of the buildings were marked with yellow tape. I then walked Detective Argel and Lieutenant Nick through the scene as I knew and observed. At this time, I returned to HQ. I spoke with each officer to make sure they were okay. I then went and checked on our witnesses and spoke with Commander Molitor. I also requested Commander Sturr obtain replacement weapons for the officers prior to sending them home. No further details at this time.
On above date, I, Lieutenant J.L. Johnson, was working as the shift commander for the police department in the city of Green Bay. At approximately 200, I heard over the police radio in the office that officers were being dispatched to Fat Daddy's Tavern, 1629 Main Street, to investigate the report of a physical fight. I was partially listening to this call as it unfolded, as I assumed the duties of the shift commander. While officers were responding, dispatch received and radioed information that the suspects from this disturbance had gone mobile in a vehicle. Shortly thereafter, Officer E. Allen radioed that he had a vehicle matching the description supplied that was traveling westbound on Main Street at a high rate of speed. The vehicle ultimately ended up in the 700 block of Bodart. Shortly after this information was given out, officers on scene reported that there were shots fired and there were subjects down. Having not been on scene and only listening to the details of this event over the radio, I had very limited information in regards to the chronological order of how this incident unfolded. After it was tactically feasible and the scene was reasonably secured, Lieutenant Lowe phoned me and gave me a brief overview of the scene. He reported that 4 officers had been involved in a firefight with at least one suspect, and that 2 parties had sustained gunshot wounds. Lowe requested that I start making notifications to the appropriate administrative staff. He further informed me that the officers who had been involved would need to have their weapons collect as evidence. As they cleared from the scene, Lieutenant Lowe directed them to report to me and swap out their weapons. A brief time later, Officers Saltzman, Kane, and Richgels reported to me. Saltzman handed me a magazine and informed me that he had done an in-battery reload with the magazine during the incident. He then turned the magazine over to be logged as evidence. I collected the magazine and placed it in a paper bag and marked the bag with Salzman's name. Salzman told me he had swapped his handgun unseen with Officer Merrill, and that Merrill was en route to the station with it. I then retrieved a Model 21 Glock from the closet in the shift commander's office and swapped weapons with Richgall's. The loaner Glock, serial number EVA753, was unloaded, so Richgall utilized one of the magazines in his magazine pouch to load the weapon with. I then placed Richgall's weapon in a paper bag and marked it with his name. Officers Merrill and E. Allen then arrived at the station. In Merrill's possession, he had a paper bag containing Officer Kane's weapon. I collected the weapon and took custody of it. Merrill also supplied me with Salzman's weapon that I placed in a paper bag and marked with Salzman's name. I then swapped my personal weapon for Officer E. Allen's weapon. I also placed his weapon in a paper bag with his name on it. None of the weapons were altered in any way and were preserved in the manner in which the officers had holstered them after this incident had occurred. After I had gathered all the weapons and magazines, I temporarily placed them in a locked closet in the shift commander's office until I was later able to relocate them to a locker in the evidence room. This evidence locker was number 16. No further details.
I, Officer Merrill, was dispatched to assist other officers on a traffic stop. Officers had radioed, "Shots fired" to the dispatcher, and the dispatcher dispatched other units to assist. When I arrived on scene, I parked my marked squad car just north of the intersection of Quincy and Bodart Street. I saw Officer Salzman kneeling down by a male who was sitting on the ground. They were on the passenger side of a red four-door car that was parked at the entrance to a north/south alley in the middle of the 700 block of Bodart Street. There were several other officers on scene already. I walked over to Officer Salzman and asked him if he needed help. He said he needed to get his guy, the male handcuffed and sitting on the ground, to a squad car. I grabbed the male's right arm under his shoulder, and Officer Salzman grabbed the male's left arm under his left shoulder. We helped the male to a standing position. The male started to yell in pain and said that his legs were broken. I started to move my hands away from the male to help him sit down again, but he stood up on his own. I asked him how and when he broke his legs. He said it had happened in the past. I asked him again how and when he had broken his legs. And now he told me to fuck off and that I better get him some help. He continued to scream like he was in pain, but he stayed standing. We helped him back to a marked squad car and placed him in the caged back seat of a marked squad car. I asked Officer Salzman what happened and if he was okay. He said that the guy rushed out of the car and shot at them. I asked Officer Salzman if he shot his gun, and he said yes. I asked him to take my gun, and I would take his for evidence security. We switched handguns and holstered the weapons. The scene was very hectic. There were a lot of people outside and also in the 720 Club, bar on Bodart Street. I asked Officer Roberts to see if he could get some medical attention for the male that claimed his legs were broken. Lieutenant Lowe told me to go to the back of the 720 Club and help with getting the names of the patrons in the bar. I took down 19 names and information. 3 of the people I spoke with said that they were sitting in the front of the 720 Club and saw what happened. I had these 3 females stand near an isolated wall, and I asked them not talk to each other until I came to speak with them again. Other officers got the police department's paddy wagon to transport all of the witnesses. The 3 females I identified as witnesses were transported to the station and interviewed by detectives. The detectives wrote down the 3 females' information. I copied the other 16 names onto other party info sheets at the station. I was getting ready to leave to drive my marked squad car to the station to turn Officer Salzman's handgun over to the shift commander. Lieutenant Lowe had also switched handguns with Officer Kane. So he had me take Officer Kane's handgun with me to the shift commander. I got a brown paper bag, and Lieutenant Lowe set Officer Kane's handgun in the bag, and I took it to the shift commander when I returned to the Green Bay Police Department. I arrived at the PD and went to Lieutenant Johnson. I turned both handguns over to him. The handguns were in brown paper bags. Officer Salzman was in the shift commander's room with Officers E. Allen, Richgels, and Kane. Officer Salzman and I walked to the locker room, and he gave me my handgun back. I returned to the scene and was placed at the intersection of Bodott at Quincy Street to secure the crime scene and update the crime scene log. Officer Pakala relieved me at 6:35 a.m. I returned the station and completed my paperwork. See all other forms, documents, and reports for further information.